Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. Dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, ETH is currently trading at around $2,700 or so. One of the things that has been sort of a common pattern for ETH, especially over the last year or so, is a capitulation wick that we get usually about 2 weeks after, and I know this sounds crazy, right? But about 2 weeks after the Bank of Japan raises rates. Now, the reason why you could argue there is a core or a narrative to support that idea is because whenever the Bank of Japan raises rates, it theoretically does unwind some of the carry trade, which does hit risk assets. And when that happens, after a couple of weeks or so, we see a sell off in the market. You'll notice that ETH had a capitulation in April and August and February. And you'll notice if you overlay interest rates in Japan, you'll notice that they raised rates in March, July, and January. So again, this has been something we've been talking about for probably 8 or 9 months now, because it was pretty obvious after the first one that what was going on, and it just kind of keeps on happening. So I do think there's a lot of relevance there. Now, beyond just looking at monetary policy in Japan, I do think that when you look at the chart, you'll see a pattern that sort of emerges when these capitulations actually occur. And what you see is sort of a capitulation, and then right after that, the market will generally trend higher for a couple of weeks or so, right? Sort of a knee-jerk reaction off the capitulation wick. And then there's another drop after that. You can see there was another drop right there, and then there was another drop right here. So again, I obviously can't say for sure if that's going to happen for Ethereum. It's all just dubious speculation, but I wouldn't be that surprised if we see ETH USD sort of fall back in here in the coming weeks if it follows this pattern that we've seen, right? Where it gets a capitulation wick, bounces, and then comes back down to try to find another sort of macro higher low, or maybe not a macro higher low, but just a higher low compared to the wick. Now, we've been following that for a long time. The potential issue right now, right, is, well, if the Bank of Japan raising rates has caused ETH USD to capitulate, which I'm not even, there's a chance I'm wrong, right? There's a chance I was right about these drops after the Bank of Japan raised rates, but maybe it was for the wrong reasons. So if you do believe that the unwind of the carry trade is having this effect on ETH, then you could argue, well, is it going to happen again? And in that case, if you think it has an effect, then it might be worthwhile to figure out, well, when's the next time the Bank of Japan's going to raise rates, right? Well, they just raised rates in January. They don't really have a strong history in recent times of raising rates consecutively, right? But that doesn't mean they can't. As it stands right now, I believe the goal for, at the Bank of Japan is to raise rates to 1% by January of 2026. Now, right now, they're already at 0.5%. So essentially what they're looking to do is get a couple more 25 basis point rate hikes in between now and January of 2026. So about 11 months. Now, the conjecture has been that the next increase will come in July. And that could make sense. I mean, that was, if you look at last year, they had one in July. I wouldn't be that, shocked if they did another one in July. But there's been some, and I think most analysts right now would actually say July is the most likely outcome. So I'm not trying to say that they're wrong. What I'm suggesting is that there have been some former BOJ members, Bank of Japan members, that have said that if things keep going the way they are with the economy and inflation, where things are picking up, they might have to raise rates sooner. It might end up happening sooner than July. So if you look at what's going on in Japan, inflation in Japan just came in at 4%. Last month, it was at 3.6. So while a lot of countries were raising rates in 2022 and 2023, the Bank of Japan was not, right? So if you were to overlay, say, US interest rates on this chart, you'll see that the US was raising, Japan wasn't doing anything, right? So they're kind of lagging everyone else in a sense. And because they never raised rates, inflation's going up there a lot more than it is right now in a lot of other countries. So it's hard to know exactly where inflation's going to go, but you know how we spent a lot of time talking about the 10-year yield in the States? We'll talk about the 10-year yield and how whenever it gets a big move up, it tends to cause risk assets to face headwinds. The 10-year yield right now for the US hasn't, and it's basically been trending down for a few weeks. But if you look at it in Japan, take a look what's going on, right? I mean, it's basically just going parabolic right now. So it does raise the question, right? Could you actually get another rate hike in Japan before ETH is able to recover from this drop? Okay, so what I'm sort of thinking right now is previously there would be a drop and then ETH would recover. Normally April, sort of the first half of the year, it's sort of it's an easier time to recover. The markets tend to be a little bit more risk on. And I know people are always like, we'll sell in May and go away, but a lot of times the markets do okay in May, especially the first couple of weeks. Now, this obviously corresponded to the ETF news, but again, a lot of times the markets see that type of move in early May. Then it happened again, right? And that time it took a longer recovery. Now, the reason you could argue it took a longer recovery over here than over here, I have to remind myself, some people tell me that they don't actually watch the video, they just listen to it, and I say over here a lot. So basically what I'm saying is that the reason why it potentially took a longer time to recover in, August was because it was already in a time when seasonality really isn't that great. Okay? Whereas in the first part of the year, seasonality was pretty strong. So I'm just wondering, right, if there's a chance that ETH USD is going to go through this process again, where it gets this, this 2-week rally, and then, struggles a little bit, and then hopefully picks up later on. Now you might say, well, is there bad seasonality at this point in the year, right? And what I would say is if you look at, this is going to come back to Bitcoin, right? I mean, if Bitcoin's doing well, ETH USD is generally doing okay. If Bitcoin's not doing well, then ETH USD is generally not doing okay. And Bitcoin at this point, I think it's going to be highly correlated to what stocks are doing. Stocks right now are just below 6,100. So what I would defer to is to go over to, say, like the year-to-date ROI of the stock market. So if you look at indices in stocks, and we look at just the S&P 500 and look at the year 2025 and average out all prior post-election years, there can be weakness in March for whatever reason, right? For whatever reason, like there can be weakness in March, and then you can see that on average the market then picks up in April of post-election years. So what's really interesting is that a lot of times, the summer months really aren't that great for crypto. They're not. But one of the things I was looking at, if you look at quarterly returns for Bitcoin, actually, if you look at quarterly returns for Bitcoin, and you actually compare this quarter to 2017, you can see that Bitcoin didn't really go up that much in Q1 of 2017. You see that? I mean, it only went up 9%. And right now, Bitcoin's up 4% in 2025, Q1. So I do wonder if there's sort of a suggestion here that, and look at what Bitcoin did in Q2 and Q3, right? It did a lot better, but in Q3 of 2016 and 2015, it didn't really do that great. So it's almost like the seasonality is even a little different in post-election years than what you see previously, because normally, like what we've seen in Q1 of 2023 and Q1 of 2024 is Bitcoin did really, really well. And then in Q2 or Q3, it struggled. in 2016 and 2017, well, 2016, when 2016 started, Bitcoin didn't do that well. But you can see that in 2017, it wasn't really that big of a move. And then it did better in Q2, Q3. So if there is unfavorable seasonality for the next month or so, then it very well could lead Ethereum down a similar path, right? Sort of down one of these similar types of moves where it falls back in, and then doesn't go back up until later on in the year, right? That's always a possibility, and I just want people to remember that. One of the things that I think ETH needs to really do well is for ETH Bitcoin to start doing well. And I think that is ETH's biggest issue right now, and why it is stuck in traffic on Struggle Street so much is because ETH Bitcoin hasn't really picked back up, right? It always looks to a lot of people like it's going to go up, and then it doesn't. It just keeps going down, and it's sort of just a reminder that last cycle that ETH Bitcoin bottomed around the time that QT ended, and QE began. So I think you have to remember that, right? Until that happens, there could still be this relative weakness by ETH. There's a lot of people that say, right, you should front run everything. But again, if you go back and look at what everyone has said about altcoins throughout the last 3 years, they've all been about front running, the alts and going with alts over Bitcoin. In reality, Bitcoin dominance never actually stopped going higher. And you could almost argue that it's because people keep sort of going full degen on this stuff that causes, monetary policy to potentially stay tighter for longer. It's kind of like a game of chicken with investors and the Federal Reserve. Now, I don't really completely believe that. I do think obviously it has more to do with the economy, but obviously the economy is partially related to the performance of risk assets. If risk assets are doing well, people are more likely to spend more money. The economy is more likely to do well. So I wonder if this is sort of the key here, is the end of quantitative tightening, to really help allow ETH Bitcoin to bottom, at which point I think ETH USD would look a lot stronger. But that just hasn't happened yet. And if this, like, if ETH USD gets sort of stuck down here and is unable to get back up in this area in the short term, then as you get into the summer months, if the seasonality plays out like last year and the year before in the summer, then it's not impossible for ETH USD to sort of tag that trend line one more time into a lower low and then go up from there. And I just want people to remember that this is a pattern that we have seen before, by various assets throughout the years, where they get one low, they get another low, and then they get their final low, and then they go up. That is a pattern. We've seen it multiple times in the past. One of those patterns is actually the S&P 500 in 1990. That's actually sort of the pattern that it ultimately carried out before it really continued its overall bull run. Look at what happened in 1990, right? Like the S&P came up here and it more or less put in a triple top, and then basically put in like a low, and then a lower low, and then a lower low later on. Now, what you'll notice is if you take a date range on this first tag of the trend line to the next tag was about 14 weeks. Now, if you look at ETH, this tag of the trend line, right, this tag of the trend line right here to this next wick was about 17 weeks. But then the time between this one and this one was about 35 weeks. So it was more than double the amount of time, and technically speaking, the S&P was able to take out these highs right there. If you look at ETH USD, you can see this high right here was around 4,090. This high right there was 4,093, and then that one was 4,107. So this does look similar, right? Like you have a higher high, right? You have a high, and then a lower high, and then a higher high. The S&P, it was the same thing for the most part. You have sort of a high here at 3. This wick might have actually been a little bit higher. Let me see. So this high right here is 360.44. that wick right there was 360.59. So very, very slightly higher. But overall, the trend does look similar. You have a high, another high, and then you sweep these highs. You have a low, lower low, and then one final low. And again, this was about 2.5 times the length between these lows. So if that were to play out, 34 weeks, let's see how long it's been, right? So right now, we're already out about 24 weeks. 34 weeks would be double the amount of time. That would put you in April, right? That would put you around that April time frame. But if it's longer than that, if it happens to be just a little bit longer than that, let's say 2.5 times, so let's add like another 8 or 9 weeks, that gets you out until about June. About June. Now, the reason I mention that is because in the last FOMC minutes, they have said that there's a good chance they're going to end quantitative tightening this summer. That's sort of the average view by participants in the that we saw in the FOMC minutes. So what if that's how it plays out? Like what if, the market bounces around here for a while, right? It just kind of bounces around there. And then you get a drop into that low around the time the Fed ends quantitative tightening. And it could also correspond to the next rate hike by the Bank of Japan, right? Now they're saying July right now is the most likely outcome, but some of them have speculated it could come earlier, right? I would be surprised if it happened in March, but who knows? It could come in April, it could come in May, it certainly could come earlier. And if that were to happen, right, if this process were to play out, then it would, in fact, take Ethereum deeper into the logarithmic regression trend line. It would actually take it to right around where that fair value is, okay, based on fit to quote-unquote non-bubble data. I just, I know this has sort of become a meme at this point, but I do think it's a relevant way to think about the market. And, the other way is if you want to look at the more optimistic scenario for ETH, would be to say, well, what if it's just putting in another higher low, right? Which it very well could be. But I think my argument for Ethereum is that if it is just another higher low, then it likely just means that Bitcoin goes to new highs, okay? And if Bitcoin goes to new highs, then you would likely see ETH underperform Bitcoin again, because again, that's what's happened the entire cycle. It hasn't changed, and I don't think it's going to change until we actually get a big pivot in monetary policy. So you could argue that if ETH does bounce here and gets back above its bull market support band and does go to new highs, you could make the argument that ETH Bitcoin would in fact still bleed, because every other time that has happened, ETH Bitcoin has bled, right? I mean, it's not like, ETH USD held support there, ETH Bitcoin bled. ETH USD held support here, ETH Bitcoin bled. ETH USD held support right there, and ETH Bitcoin bled. If it holds support here again, it might cause ETH Bitcoin to bleed. But here's the thing about ETH, is that if you look at last cycle, when did ETH Bitcoin stop bleeding? It was after it failed to hold the higher low support, right? ETH Bitcoin last cycle bottomed here. So after ETH USD broke down, right? After it broke down, that's when ETH Bitcoin bottomed, because that is what ushered in the end of quantitative tightening and looser monetary policy by the Federal Reserve. So what I'm trying to sort of communicate, and admittedly I don't always do it the best, what I'm trying to communicate is that the way for ETH Bitcoin to truly and convincingly bottom, where people are actually going to believe it, I think, would be for it to break down here. But it only breaks down if Bitcoin struggles to put in a new high, right? So if Bitcoin struggles to put in a new high, then it would likely cause ETHUSD to break below support, which would then likely lead to a change in monetary policy. Okay, remember, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed when ETHUSD lost support. So And you can see that after it had this capitulation right here in July 2019, it basically rallied back up for a little while, but it got squeezed between that higher low structure and its bull market support band. And eventually it broke down. You could argue the same thing's happening, right? I mean, like, it's getting squeezed here between this support line and the bull market support band. Now, again, it looked like it was doing the same thing back over there, but it broke up. The reason it went up was because Bitcoin went up. So again, I mean, it all comes back to the same thing, right? If you want to hold ETH, you want to really be confident that ETH Bitcoin is bottomed. But history shows that ETH Bitcoin doesn't bottom until after ETH USD breaks down. ETH USD doesn't break down until Bitcoin shows weakness. So again, when you're thinking of as an investor, like, would you rather hold Bitcoin or would you rather hold ETH? I think in this case is even though I think that ETH Bitcoin is really, really close to a bottom, and I own ETH. I do have ETH. I also, just from like an academic perspective, I have to be open-minded to the idea that ETH Bitcoin could still show weakness until QT ends. And I also know from last cycle, ETH Bitcoin did not bottom until ETH USD lost support. So that's kind of the thing that I go back to. And I know it's an exhausting cycle. And I think like, I do think that a lot of the people for ETH are just kind of, like, obviously, basically the way this has worked is I keep wanting ETH to go to the regression band so that I think ETH Bitcoin can really convincingly bottom. So I keep wanting for it. I keep talking about it, and it just keeps not happening. And so obviously a lot of people laugh at that view. And look, guys, I do get things wrong. Absolutely, I do get things wrong, and this is one of them. This has been one of them. But the point is, I'm not even trying to say that it can't go up. It's just that if it goes up, it's only because Bitcoin went up. Again, and that's the point. That's the reason why looking at their Bitcoin valuations is so useful. There's people on Twitter or X that will say, well, it's a win if you bought if you bought Ethereum in 2022 and it's up now. And I guess if you value your portfolio in US dollars, you could argue that, but it's sort of like saying, imagine buying ETH when its Bitcoin valuation was 0.08 and now saying you won now that the Bitcoin valuation is 0.02, right? Like, it just, when you really think about it, you took on a lot more risk and you got a lot less reward, a lot less. Sure, ETH is up, 2 to 3x off the lows, but Bitcoin is up like 6x off the lows. So again, this is why Bitcoin dominance is important. So if you really, again, and I've said this before, for the ETH maxis to get what they want, right? For them to get what they want, and that's a bottom for ETH Bitcoin for the cycle, they have to go, my opinion, is that ETH has to go where they don't want it to go, right? It has to go down here. If it doesn't go down there, then they can still celebrate they can still celebrate higher highs on ETH USD. But at the end of the day, it'll probably still bleed against Bitcoin. So as I said in videos going back for over a year now, it's not that ETH can't go higher. It's just that the only way it's going to go higher is if Bitcoin does. And if Bitcoin's going to go higher, you're probably better off with Bitcoin. Now, at this point in the cycle, for a long time, I was just 99% Bitcoin. With ETH Bitcoin this low, even though I feel very strongly about sort of my interpretation of the market in that sense, like that ETH USD would need to break down for ETH Bitcoin to truly bottom, I also know that it's possible I'm wrong about that. And, I do think that ETH Bitcoin has gone down pretty far at this point. And it's not about sort of like the absolute bottom. There's always a chance that ETH Bitcoin shows weakness, but then puts in sort of a higher low there and then picks up. So I don't want to suggest that it's impossible for the low to be in for ETH Bitcoin, but I wonder if if it will play out like the last cycle. And obviously I'm not completely, out of touch with what happened in 2017. I mean, I remember it very clearly. ETH Bitcoin started to go up, and it really started moving in March. But also, it was already trending up. It had bottomed in December and had been trending up for a little while before it even made that move. So I'm not like completely out of touch with that potential reality, which is why I do think like hedging can make absolute sense, right? I mean, absolutely it can. But I also want people to recognize that last cycle, we didn't actually see things turn around until monetary policy shifted. And we just haven't seen that yet. So there does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin bounces back to the bull market support band and then comes back down to a double bottom as the Fed ends quantitative tightening. Like, that's a possibility. Sort of like something like that, and then up. Like, that's also a possibility. But I think that it's really easy for people just sort of declare things and be very confident about them, especially as it relates to sort of Ethereum. But the reality is that it really has underperformed this cycle, and I think that for anyone who followed its Bitcoin valuation and the monetary policy view, I think it was a pretty clear and obvious thing that was happening. Now that a lot of people are more aware that monetary policy affects all Bitcoin pairs, now you have people sort of talking about monetary policy a lot more. But in my opinion, it's often misinterpreted, right? What people are talking about, what they're thinking is happening in with monetary policy in Asia. I think it's completely misinterpreted by a lot of people to try to justify certain ideas. But those are my views, right? Those are my views on ETH Bitcoin and ETH USD. If ETH USD goes higher, it's only because Bitcoin went higher. And if ETH USD goes lower, then it could actually allow for ETH Bitcoin to bottom out for the cycle. So it's one of those things where, like, in order to get what you want, you have to go where you don't want to go. If you don't go to where you don't want to go, you might still see ETH go up, but it's probably going to keep bleeding on its Bitcoin pair as that sort of type of the quantitative tightening bull market would continue in that sense. But anyways, guys, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you for tuning in. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.